And I guess, Kristen, you're gonna hit recording. Okay, cool. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Jordan. Matt Jordan is a student at University of Texas in his final year. He has been doing a lot of cool work as part of the DCLM projects. Really curious about what he's going to talk about, especially around deduplication. I'm not going to steal Matt any more time. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Luca.
And Matt, remind everyone on the call when you would like to take any questions.
Right. So, hi. This will be my talk on deduplication of large-scale text data sets. This is my first time giving this talk, so I think I'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, but there's also going to be a spot in the middle, which would be great for questions. But if you have anything really burning, please just interrupt me. This can be a little more casual. And I guess I should also give a little bit of a bio. As Lucas said, I'm in my final year of my PhD, but most of what I worked on in my PhD has been on adversarial example research, so more theoretical side of provable verification for robustness. And only for the past year, I've been working on language models. I've been fortunate enough to kind of sit in at UW and Ludwig Schmidt's group and work on this DCLM project. So I'm only going to talk about things that I've done in the past year and some things that I'm currently working on now. So let's get started. All right, cool. Just as a roadmap for this talk, I want to spend maybe about a third of this talk, so 15, 20 minutes, talking about this cool project that just hit the archive in June, and we should be getting NeurIPS review sometime this week, called DataComp for Language Models. And then I want to spend most of the talk talking about my specific role in that project and all of the lessons I've learned about deduplication for large-scale text data sets. And then hopefully have a little bit of time to think about some of the open questions, the sort of things that I'm continuing to work on, and then questions from you all. So when I think about machine learning for language models, I kind of like to think of it in three sort of independent black boxy steps. You have your data sets, you have your model, and you have your evaluation pipeline. And really the goal here with all of these three things is, how can we achieve AGI? Except that's kind of a joke. We don't really care about AGI. Really what we care about is how can we get the best language model for downstream tasks. And by downstream tasks, I mean like, I want an AI assistant to write some code for me. I want an AI assistant to write an email that I'm a little too lazy to write. And specifically here, I just want to focus on building a good data set. I feel like there's a lot of innovation in the model side of things with training and optimizers and, two-step training, fine-tuning. And the eval side of things, there's like chain of thought and prompting and all that. I think the data side of things is kind of underexplored. There's a lot of room to grow there. And I think maybe that's also because data is really hard to work on. Building better data sets and the research there is kind of an imprecise science. And that's coming from two things. One is that you're really far away from the eval pipeline. Ultimately what you care about is getting a good number in terms of like some sort of GMS@k or MMOU. You want a good number at the very end. But to get there, you have to train a model and then do all these like steps with that are kind of expensive. The other reason why data sets are kind of hard to work on is because it's kind of a dark art building a data set for a language model. Like there's this tweet and it's a joke, but it's not really that much of a joke, right? So I think it captures the spirit of what it's like to build data sets for language models where, first you start with Common Crawl, then you're going to add in a cleaned up version of Common Crawl, which is C4, and then you're going to do some sorcery with your data processing. And then maybe you're going to do some mixing with like some high quality sources like Wikipedia or GitHub, or maybe you like ignore copyright, you steal a bunch of books and you parse some PDFs, and then you do a bunch more sort of sorcery and dark art. And it's really kind of imprecise, and it's hard to make a science out of this. And it's even harder to do that if you don't fix the model and the eval steps. So if you're making innovations alongside model and eval along with your data set, then it becomes extremely difficult to come up with like novel and scientific improvements here. So that's the whole purpose of this new project, DataComp LM, which I mentioned, it's now in the archive, everything is public. But DataComp for language models, it's really a benchmark. It's a sort of a competition. It's a game where the model and the eval, this language model training pipeline are going to be fixed. And we're going to fix them with this OpenLM repository. So OpenLM, just as a side note, is this really cool open source repository that a lot of folks at UW, including myself, have worked on that just does state-of-the-art training and evaluation for a language model, and it's sort of a necessary building block if you want to do data research. But DataComp focuses only on the data set side of things. And like I said, it's a game, and the game is going to work like this. So let's say you're a user, a researcher, a player, right? The first thing you're going to do is you're going to pick a scale. You're going to pick like what level of competition do you want to enter, and the scale is going to say, okay, we're going to be playing with language models of this size that take this many tokens. So you're strictly in this compute limited regime where you have a fixed number of tokens that you're allowed to see during training. And the token, the scales range from something that's like 400 million parameters and 8 billion tokens, which can take a couple of days on an A100 to train. So hopefully accessible by most academic labs. And then you have scales that are kind of large, like a 7 billion parameter model that takes 270, 280 billion tokens. And it's take thousands of GPU hours, which maybe is not that accessible unless you have like industry level compute. So the user's going to pick a scale, and then they're going to build a data set. So we provide, as part of this project, like as a deliverable, this really large collection of sort of minimally preprocessed data called DCLM pool. And that's on the order of 200 trillion tokens. And we provide other data sets as well, but we have this 200 trillion token data set, and you have a fixed budget of, like, let's say somewhere between 8 and 200 billion tokens to pick from there. You want to pick the best documents from that data set and say, this is my data set I want to use to train a language model. And if you also want to say, well, I have this high quality source, I have all of these books, or I parsed the archive or something, you can do that too. And then we have a separate track for this competition there. And then, once your contribution is you've created this data set that's been curated and cleaned and you think is going to be really good for training a language model, then you use our OpenLM framework to train a language model with a fixed recipe, and then you evaluate it using our evaluation suite of like 53 downstream tasks, which we hope to be kind of reliable and have low variance and give you good scaling. So that's the game. But when you want to make a story out of this, we have to make an archive paper. We want people to play it. So I guess the actual deliverables, like what DCLM really is, it's this open benchmark for evaluating these pre-training data sets. So that's what I described, this game, right? It says, it's a benchmark. You give us a data set, and then you have to do some extra compute. We got to train the models. That's expensive. But you give us a data set, and we'll give you a number. And we're trying to have a leaderboard and get a sense for like feeling like a very rigorous way to evaluate pre-training data sets. Now, in building this benchmark, we also had to build a bunch of tools, right? We have to build the model training pipelines. We have to build the right evaluation suite. We have to build lots and lots of pre-processing stuff because we need to play this game ourselves quite a bit. So we also include in our GitHub many, many really high quality tools, which I think are actually really good code for academic standards for data set creation. And, building data sets and then tokenizing them and shuffling them and getting them all set ready to feed to a language model during training. We also played this game a bunch. So this also generated us a collection of really good open data sets. So we have this data set that I mentioned, this pool, which is 200 trillion tokens, but we also have our best filtration, which gets down to about 4 trillion tokens, and it lets us train actually kind of a really good model. And then you can play and maybe do even more filtration and get even smaller, more highly quality data sets from that. So we have all of these data sets that are open. You can download the tokens on Hugging Face, and the recipes for how we created them. It's also public. And also in playing this game, we kind of had to train hundreds of models. I think we trained over 420 language models from scratch in building this project. So it's really big, and we figured out like a lot of things, and we have this like nice sense of what makes a good data set. So we have this like really sort of comprehensive and thorough suite of careful ablations that we've run on things from like deduplication to the mixing ratios to things like that. And then finally, because we played this game so much and we've created a lot of models, some of those models were pretty good. So we release a fully open source pre-trained model as well. So we have a 7 billion parameter model that is open in the sense that the weights are public, but also the data set is public, and all the code used to generate everything is also public. And just to kind of like talk about that model itself, here we have sort of the scores for this model compared to a bunch of other open language models. On the y-axis here on this chart here, you have our eval metrics, and on the x-axis is the sort of compute used to train the model. So the DCLM baseline, our sort of submission here is the orange diamond, and you can kind of see it at the top, which is always great. You want the your contribution to kind of be at the top of your chart. And if you want to look at like straight numbers, just taking a screenshot from our leaderboard, our models on the very bottom here, which it's a 7 billion model, trained on 2.5 trillion tokens, and it acquires almost 64 in the MMLU metric, which is pretty good. It definitely is, it's a higher number than the other open source models that have open data sets, but maybe isn't going to be quite as good as some of the models that are of a similar size that have closed data sets. But we would argue that we're actually doing significantly better than Llama 2 when Llama 2 had been trained on only 2.5 trillion tokens. So I think that's kind of a testament to the power of data curation here. So I guess that's the project, but I want to summarize quickly what we have learned from the project. So the key findings from DCLM, because there was a lot of things that we learned. I think the first thing, maybe it's kind of standard and noticeable, and maybe it isn't too surprising, is that many eval metrics are really noisy. If you want to do really careful science and train a bunch of models and try and say, okay, well, this little knob that I tweaked made the model better, need really reliable measurements. And we found that a lot of the sort of standard eval metrics are really sensitive to noise, be it like from the initialization or the shuffling of the data set. So one key contribution here is we found a collection of eval metrics which have two properties. One is that they're pretty low variance in that they're not going to change too much when you try training from a different seed. And two, that they correlate really nicely with the sort of downstream performance. Especially at scale. So like, if this metric is high at this lower scale, then it's probably sort of a nice hint that this metric is going to be high and correlate nicely with a high like MMLU at like a larger scale. The next thing we learned is that data curation matters. Maybe this is fairly obvious, but I think it's really important to note that the whole point of this research is to argue that this does matter. And we find that we actually can do significantly better by a really careful and thorough data curation and filtration process. And then we have some surprising results. So one is that the standard is to mix in some high quality data like Wikipedia and such into your data sources, and hopefully that should give you a better result. We found that once you thoroughly clean Common Crawl, once you do enough filtration there, and then you mix in high quality data sets, they stop helping. In fact, they actually hurt a little bit. So the argument there is that maybe you don't really need to do a ton of mixing if the sources that you're mixing are already contained in the web. Things like that are copyrighted like books, maybe you still want to add those in. But Wikipedia, you can probably get all the juice out of Wikipedia just by thoroughly cleaning Common Crawl. Another thing is that since we're all ML people, a standard thing you might want to consider is, okay, I have this big pool of data and I want to find the good data and the bad data. Why don't I train a classifier to do that? Why don't I just have a classifier that says, let's look at this document. Is this a good document that I should include in my training set, or is this garbage and I should not include it in my training set? And we found here that simple is better. So we found that simple n-gram classifiers that are sort of linear models, kind of like a fast text, actually do a much better job at identifying the good training data points than the bad training data points. Which you might think that, okay, well, let's be more sophisticated here, but this is one of those rare cases where simple is actually better. Another thing you might want to say is you might want to apply this classic algorithm called graduate student descent, where you take a bunch of grad students like myself and you ask us to manually label a bunch of data and then say, okay, humans have a good sense for what is a good training data point and a bad training data point. Let's just ask the grad students to do that, and let's train a classifier on top of that. Turns out that's not that good. In fact, it's actually kind of surprisingly bad. You might think that humans have a really good sense of what a language model would want, but I think we tried it and we found that, well, it's really not that reliable. It's really not clear what language models want. And then finally, what I want to spend the rest of the talk talking about is deduplication. And we found that deduplication is important. And I think I can say that I think deduplication is maybe one of the best bang for your buck steps that you can do with building a good data set. Okay, so that's DCLM. I guess now would be a good time to take a few questions on that, but I'm going to definitely have some time at the end. So just if there's anything burning right now, I'll pause for a moment. Okay. So now we can get like a little philosophical.
Oh, yep. I did have a question. Your simple n-gram classifiers are not trained on human labels?
No, they're trained on the positive examples here are trained on like high quality data sets, and the negative, like we think that the top scoring comments from Reddit explain like on 5, that's like our positives, and like, you know, negatives is like other stuff from the web.
Right.
Okay. I think we can get now a little philosophical and talk about, you know, since we want to make good data sets, what do we know about data sets? You know, what are good starting points in building good data sets? The first starting point, and maybe I should say that we use know here in the sense that, you know, this is an empirical science, you know, I'm not writing proofs anymore, but, you know, there's things that we kind of really believe to be true and be really shocked if they weren't. The first thing we know is that scaling laws apply. So scaling laws just say that if you feed more data into your model or you make your model bigger in terms of parameter counts, it's going to do better in terms of loss. And they also give you some sort of like trend line behavior that allows you to extrapolate a little bit and say, well, if I fed this much more data, I would expect my loss to be this much better. Unfortunately, these scaling laws are not that favorable in the sense that you notice on the x-axis here, this is a log scale, and the y-axis is not a log scale, which is to say that there's really diminishing returns, and you have to supply, you know, significantly more data to get marginal improvements. So that's unfortunate. We also know that the data set quality matters. So this is a chart taken from the Ask LLM paper. But basically, you know, they're just showing that if we filter our data set for a language model, and we, you know, just take the high quality stuff, we can achieve the same loss with way fewer tokens. And if we keep going to the same amount of tokens, we can do much better. Which is to say that there's definitely some gains to be had by filtering your data sets. You can kind of see the same thing in the image classification domain. There's a lot more research in image data set curation because image models are much cheaper to train. But this is a paper from 2022 for image stuff, and they have some theory here, which is nice. But the argument is that data filtration can't really overcome scaling laws, but it can attain more favorable scaling laws. So, you know, you're always going to have this marginal diminishing returns with data, but if you filter your stuff really carefully, you can actually get, you know, you can squeeze more juice out of the data. And you know, I guess it's kind of a mixed bag. You know, there's going to be some Pareto frontier, but there's still room to grow. And then the third thing we know about data sets is that training language models is expensive, which isn't really about data sets, but I think it matters in 2 steps. One is that, as I mentioned, it's really expensive to train a language model and then, you know, go through that whole process to get the evaluation numbers if you're just toggling the data set, which is kind of discouraging because it makes research hard. You have to be very, very careful about which experiments you run, unless you have an infinite compute budget. But the good side of this is that because training language models are so expensive, you do have a lot of room to play with data curation. You know, at some point, if language model training is so expensive, then the gains are huge because, you know, if you can make your language model 44% more data efficient, like with Ask LLM, then, you know, you can save yourself a lot of money. But also, you have a lot of budget to play around with curating your data. You have a lot of time, and, you know, it seems like, you know, it's very worth it to invest maybe even like, you know, hundreds or thousands of CPU hours into building good data sets if it saves you, you know, thousands of GPU hours in the end. So I guess with these kind of principles in mind, now we can talk about what I think is the best bang for the buck, which is deduplication. I'd comment here that I think we say this in our lab a lot. There's no secret to training language models. Really, there's just a bunch of medium importance tasks that you have to do really, really well. And, you know, in DCLM, the task that I kind of chose amongst a couple, but I got really sort of invested in was the deduplication side of things. So what I'm going to drive through this section here, kind of give a discussion about the sort of, you know, notion of why we should deduplicate, a discussion on the design space, you know, what does it mean to deduplicate, you know, what are the ways that people do deduplicate, and eventually arrive at some of the ablations and things that we learned from deduplication on DCLM. Okay, so the first question, why deduplicate? Is this even a thing that we should care about? And this is a chart from a privacy paper that's just showing how many duplicates are contained in C4, which is, you know, a cleaned up version of Common Crawl, some 200 billion tokens. But the notion is that, you know, a lot of documents are unique and they occur, you know, only once, but there are, you know, thousands of documents that occur thousands of times. And, you know, if you're only doing single epoch training and you care about diversity in your data set, then maybe it's really not worth it, you know, repeating some of these documents, you know, thousands of times. So I guess this is just to show that there are lots of duplicates in training data sets. But is it even worth it to deduplicate them? So this is a chart from the Gopher paper. And this is showing that on the y-axis is loss, and each of these three charts is an evaluation benchmark. And we really only care about the blue bars on this one. So the lightest blue bar is just an unfiltered data set. The next one over is you've added some quality filtration. You get some improvements in loss, which is what you would hope. And the next one over is when you do exact deduplication. So you remove things that have exact copies, and you get an improvement in loss that's about as comparable to the filtration. And then if you also add in a fuzzy deduplication step, well, you get even more improvements. Which is to say that it's kind of the long held belief that deduplication can help your training. You're going to get a better data set if it doesn't have a ton of duplicates in it. So the notion of deduplication is kind of nebulous. There's a lot of things that can go on with deduplication. There's many choices to be made. I when I was first kind of looking into data curation and deduplication, I was saying that, oh well, there's so many things that you could do. It seems like the industry standard is kind of chosen on the vibes. It's unclear what the sort of best thing to do is. There's not a lot of good science here. So I kind of want to just go through the sort of design space and the things to consider when thinking about deduplication pipelines, and then I'm going to go through what I think is the best stuff. So I guess the first question to ask is what is a duplicate? It's not even really clear. I mean, clearly exact duplicates make sense, but what does it mean for something to be a fuzzy duplicate? And then once you've identified what is a duplicate, maybe then there's a question of what does it mean to deduplicate? What should you be removing from your data set? That's just the sort of intuitive notions. Then you have to code all of that up. So then we have to talk about how can we programmatically identify duplicates? How do we even quantify notions of duplicates? And then there's lots of things regarding engineering difficulties like scaling. Clearly, if you have, let's say, 3 billion documents in your data set, and you wanted to compare every document against every other document, even if it took order 1 time to do that, it'd still be 10 to the 18th comparisons, which seems kind of really heavy to do as a pre-processing step. And then finally, there's this notion of how do we if we have a lot of different ways to deduplicate, how do we evaluate them? Is the metric that we care about only the sort of final score, or are there other things that maybe we should be considering when we're talking about what is the best way to deduplicate a text data set? So let's start with just go through these questions. What is a duplicate? All right, so clearly, if 2 documents are copy pasted of each other, if you have this document which matches string equality with this other document, it's very easy to say that that is a duplicate. There's no doubts there. But what about when you have documents that are mostly the same? So here I have 3 documents, and they're all have a ton of X's in a row in them, but their headers are different, right? The one on the left has ABCD, the one on the right has IJKL. Will we consider these documents duplicates or near duplicates? I think there's some notion that most of the content here has been repeated. Maybe it's not worth it wasting our training budget on things that are seen before. Conversely, you can think about documents that are mostly different. So here you have 3 documents where the header is all the same. So you have A through Z at the top of each one of these documents, but the content themselves below them is different. So if we only really care about maintaining a diverse data set, then maybe the notion is that maybe you just kind of remove the header. You want to prune that header out. And this happens a lot with websites where you have a nav bar and some content, and the content is unique, but the nav bar is just repeated. Maybe let's not waste our training budget on this repeated nav bar, which maybe doesn't have a lot of interesting semantic content anyways. So I guess there's a lot of notions of duplicate, and now there's going to be a bunch of algorithms to identify each one of these. But before then, you need to say, even if we have this collection of duplicates, what do we remove? Let's say I've sort of grouped my data set like I did in that first chart where I said, okay, this is how many copies of this document occurs. How do I deduplicate? Do I remove all copies? Do I just keep one? Can I keep a couple? Certainly, I don't want to keep them all. That's clearly not what I want to do, but I think it's unclear how many should be kept. I think maybe the industry standards seem to be either keeping 0 or 1, but we're running some experiments right now to challenge that. And then there's also this question about transitivity. So if we're doing a fuzzy deduplication step, we're identifying near duplicates. You can say that if A and B are near duplicates and B and C are near duplicates, is there a transitive relationship? Are A and C near duplicates? I mean, it depends on how you quantify duplicateness. but I think that's not clear, and I think there's maybe some interesting experiments to be run where you're thinking about, the sort of triangle inequalities and metric spaces regarding like notions of duplicateness, which I guess brings to the question of how do you quantify how two documents are duplicates? Certainly, if they're exact copies, it's easy, right? Exact copies are really the simple case, we don't care. But fuzzy duplicates, kind of hard to identify what fuzzy duplicates are. And I think one intuitive notion that matters a lot that people like to use with fuzzy duplicates and quantifying, are these two documents similar, is you take a document, you split it up into overlapping chunks of tokens, right? You take like an n-gram shingling, you kind of slide it along, and you convert your document into a set. And you say if two documents have a lot of chunks in common, well, then we'll call them duplicates. And the sort of the mathematical framework for this is Jaccard similarity, which is this information theoretical notion of set similarity. But this is just a nice way to say, you get a number that says how similar two sets are. And the definition here is if you have sets A and B, you take the size of their intersection and divide it by the size of their union, and that'll give you some number. Like just as an example, if A is equal to B, then their intersection and their union are the same, so you get 1. If A and B are disjoint, then their intersection is the empty set, so you get 0. And if they share some things in common, right, you're going to get a number between 0 and 1. So that's one way to get a notion of duplicateness. But another intuitive notion of duplicateness might be if I take my document and I split it into chunks, and I sort of slide those chunks along the document, right? So I have this overlapping set of chunks. If most of these chunks have been seen before, maybe not within one particular document, but like across all the documents I've seen before, then really this document doesn't contain anything new. If the chunks are large enough, right? There's no novelty here. So maybe if enough of the chunks have been seen, maybe we'll just omit that from our training data set. And there's algorithms to do this as well. And finally, I guess there's this notion of like, I've talked about a lot of sort of design choices you can make with deduplication. I think the sort of industry standard to sort of pick these things is vibes. People have tried some things and they said, okay, we've tried these things and we've written a paper and we've sort of picked some things. Like the Jaccard similarity threshold that people seem to like is 80%. The size of the n-grams is like 5. A lot of these things are sort of unclear if that's really the right choice. It doesn't seem like there's been a ton of like science and really careful experiments on that because, well, each experiment is kind of expensive. I'd also point out that I think there are 2 metrics of interest. The first metric of interest is really how much gets removed. A really aggressive deduplication procedure might remove up to like 90% of your data set if your data set's large enough. And maybe that's not that great. Maybe it's worth it to kind of preserve some duplicates, but also preserve some diversity in your data set. So being super aggressive here and like removing too much, I think is a bad thing. And that should be kind of considered as like a sort of side-by-side metric, along with the metrics we really do care about, which is the language model metrics like perplexity and MMLU, things that tell you how good your language model is at its evaluation benchmarks at the end. If you're trying to say this deduplication pipeline is really the one that we ought to be using to train data set or train language models on web scale data sets, then I think you care about how much data you get at the end, because scaling laws still hold even with curated data, and how good is my data set at the end. So there's the language model metrics. Okay, so that's kind of the design space. I promise I'm still driving towards the ablations for DCLM, but I need to describe the types of deduplication algorithms very briefly, and so we can talk about which ones I think are the best ones. And I do want to sort of delineate the difference between these deduplication algorithms by some remove full documents. So some will mark this document as a duplicate, let's kill the whole document. And some will remove parts of documents. So they'll go inside the document and say, hey, this like substring is repeated, or this paragraph occurs 3 times. Let's get rid of that. And I think both of those are important to matter, but each algorithm kind of specifically picks one thing to focus on. So exact hash-based deduplication, right? If I just care about exact duplicates, the sort of like natural thing is I just hash the text of all the documents. And if 2 documents have the same hash, then and my hash space is big enough, it's like highly likely that they have string equality. That's like the fast way, the easy way to remove duplicates if you're looking at exact stuff. Then you have this algorithm called minhash, which is really interesting. There's a lot of moving parts here. I've implemented it in Rust and Python, and I've sweated over it a lot. But the sort of notion of minhash is that it's like a fuzzy deduplication that removes full documents. So it's just going to take a whole document and get rid of it if there's something that's kind of close to it. The way it works is it's just going to identify these documents by their Jacquard similarity. And usually you do that over like shinglings of n-grams of length 5. So this is the Jacquard similarity based probabilistic deduplication. And then you have substring deduplication, which is removing all occurrences of substrings that occur at least twice. And usually the way you do this is with a suffix array, which is a fun little data structure that is kind of interesting to build, a lot of cool properties, a lot of uses. But you build a suffix array over your entire data set, and you can say, oh, well, this substring, and usually you pick a token length of like 50 tokens, occurs 17 times. Let's remove that substring from each of these documents. And then finally, there's BFF, which is an AI2 product, which I really enjoy, like. It's great. But the BFF uses a Bloom filter to identify and remove both paragraphs and documents. So there's a lot of flexibility using Bloom filters here. And maybe I think OMA or DOMA uses like BFF for exact deduplication. But now it's been improved, and it's great for fuzzy deduplication to handle both like substrings and the whole document. And just a brief note on Bloom filters. That's a probabilistic data structure. Does like approximate membership query. So it's just a sort of big array, and you can ask it, have I seen this element before? And if the true answer is yes, it will always say yes. And if the true answer is no, it will usually say no, but it will sometimes say yes and have a false positive. But turns out that that's actually really okay. Then we use it for deduplication. Okay, so those are like sort of the key players when you talk about deduplication. And now finally we can get to oh wait, sorry. There's one other important player that I always forget about, which is this notion of sharding. So when you're doing deduplication on a really large data set, you're gonna have like 7 terabytes of data that you got to deal with, and that becomes like really heavy from an engineering perspective. One key cheap trick to make any algorithm more parallelizable is to split your data set into k shards and then just run deduplication independently on each shard. And this turns out to be actually a really important hyperparameter that we can toggle when we're talking about deduplication of text data sets. And it has like some pros and has some cons, and it has these interesting properties that arise. But the pros is that of course it makes things way more parallelizable. You don't run into like, oh, there isn't an AWS machine that can even handle this data set type of problems. So it's much more scalable, and it's typically much cheaper. So you're not having to use the AWS machines that cost like $100 an hour. You use the ones that cost like $5 an hour, but you have to use like 10 of them. A con here, though, the downside to sharding is that you can allow k copies. Maybe one copy. Let's say you have 1,000 copies of a document, and you have 10 shards. Well, it's likely that sort of one copy at least ends up in every shard. So, and that's going to survive. So maybe you're going to end up with k copies of your document at the end, which may be a bad thing. You kind of think it's a bad thing, but it's unclear. I think it depends on k. Okay, so now we can get into the ablations, some actual numbers, and like some actual results, and sort of like put all this stuff about design spaces, deduplication to the test, and get like some recommendations for how you might want to deduplicate a training data set. So the setup here, and we ran a bunch of dedupes, but the setup here is that you start with Common Crawl, and then you apply the refined web filter. So refined web is just this previous open data set, and they have this nice filtration process that's mostly heuristic, but pretty fast. And it just does things like, extracts text, and then does like some language identification to keep only the English stuff, and then does some like heuristics to remove like inline repetitions and such. It's a pretty good heuristic set. We think we should probably use that. And then we have this pool that's still really large, and we subsample it to be 76 billion tokens in size. And we're going to say that this is our base pool, it's our baseline, and we're going to run a lot of sort of deduplication, and then train, and then evaluate pipelines on top of that, right? And the things that we're training, well, we're going to train 1 billion parameter models from scratch on 29 billion tokens. So I can go back to my chart, but these things are like fairly expensive. They take like a couple of days to run on like some industry compute. So we can't do too many of them, but we can do enough of them to kind of get some signal. And then of course we evaluate. So just to get a sense for what this table is before I show it to you, the things that we tried playing with were this exact dedupe. So it's you just look at, for string equality, do hashing. We did min hash using our own set of parameters, which we think is pretty close to the Google parameters, but probably more expensive than it needs to be. We did suffix arrays for substring deduplication, and then we applied the Bloom filter And the things we care about are how many tokens you have at the end, the removal rate, and then this evaluation benchmark called core and how that differs from the baseline. Right, so we're trying to do some science here. We're trying to say, if I add in this particular deduplication algorithm, I am going to, get this much of an improvement if I only tweak how I dedupe. So here's a big table. I know this is way too big of a table to actually show in slides, so let's just kind of break it down into sort of smaller sections. So I guess I don't have a laser pointer, but what we see is that, okay, so the first row is this baseline, and that gets a score of like 40.1. And then we try just each method sort of standalone, right? So each method sort of seems to improve things, right? Every number on the right here is green compared to baseline. But if you're only going to do one deduplication algorithm, the one that seems to do best is this sort of substring plus document level BFF. Bloom filter, is better than any of the other methods combined, or any of the other methods standalone. On the other hand, if now you consider combining all of the methods, you say, okay, well, what if I consider the subset of all exact dedupe plus min hash or exact dedupe plus suffix array? The best one of these would be doing exact dedupe followed by min hash followed by suffix array for substring deduplication. And what you end up with is a core score that's within my significant figures here, exactly the same as the BFF, which is to say that BFF and this sort of kitchen sink approach are competitive, except doing this kitchen sink approach removes significantly more of your data, right? Which is to suggest that it's not just the metrics that matter, but it's how much data you have left. So far from this scale, it seems like BFF is the thing that we should be using, but then there's a question of how things work when we scale it a little more. So now we kind of had this different set of ablations with 7 billion parameter models and 138 billion tokens. So now these are significantly bigger, right? So the model is 7 times bigger, and the data set is 4 or 5 times bigger. We ran a lot of experiments here, and now we're starting to get signal at MMLU. And then now we're also starting to get to the point where we need to do sharding for an engineering perspective. And the story here is that we played around with a lot of BFF hyperparameters, but you should just pay attention to the rows that are bolded and the number, maybe the core and the MMLU number. So we did this Bloom filter with 32 shards, and we did this min hash plus suffix array with 16 shards. And we found that there's a slight difference, right? Min hash plus suffix array has fewer shards, but is a little bit better. So I think maybe the question, the sort of similar story to be said here, the conclusion would be that BFF is almost as good as their previous methods, but it does remove fewer tokens. So you end up with more tokens at the output, which I would argue is still a good thing. So it's not clear really, which one we should be doing, especially since there's fewer shards with the min hash plus suffix array. And then we can even scale this up more, so we can go from 138 billion tokens to 276 billion tokens. And then we've kind of broken the shards down a little smaller. So here we have this similar things where we're comparing BFF versus the top competitor, which is this min hash plus suffix array. And we're staying with min hash suffix array at 16 shards, and BFF now is just 10 shards. And now the numbers are about the same. The MMLU is within 1/10 of a point. We see that the BFF, the sharding is 10, and now we have fewer token yields. But I think this is sort of a nice way to think about that. The BFF and min hash plus suffix array are really similar in their performance, except BFF is significantly cheaper. And finally, this is an experiment we just ran last week, but I think this is really interesting. You're asking the question, does deduplication always help? And the short answer is no. Deduplication can sometimes hurt you. So just here's the sort of setup. We started with 4 trillion DCLM baseline tokens. So this is the sort of high quality pool that we thought we would submit for DCLM. And we note that it had been running with a 100 sharded BFF. So it had already been deduplicated a little bit, but not fully deduplicated because it was 100 shards. And then we ran this 10% filtration with fast text. So this is that sort of a data removal step, with a simple classifier. And if you train one of these 7 billion parameter 276 billion tokens, you get 43% MMLU. Actually, I think this is the 138 billion tokens, but you get a 42% MMLU. If you instead take this pool and you run a single shard of min hash. So I recently made min hash really fast and super scalable on Rust, we're trying it out on all the things. We say, oh, let's try minhash on this. If you run minhash on this, so you remove of these 4 trillion tokens, you remove all the fuzzy duplicates. You remove 93% of the tokens, first of all, which is crazy. I mean, that's supported by our numbers, and we have good reason to believe that I didn't write any bugs with minhash. But if you then take those output tokens and you train a model on them and you evaluate MMLU, you get 25% MMLU. Somehow you've just killed all the diversity in your data set, and you're basically just randomly guessing, which is just maybe nice evidence to say that super aggressive deduplication can actually be quite bad for you. So I guess it's an argument in favor of sharding. Cool. So I guess let's talk about sort of the takeaways from ablations here. So there's no clear winner between BFF and the minhash and suffix array, in my mind. Sometimes it seems like there's a lot of hyperparameters to choose from, and unfortunately I couldn't do all of those sort of like really fine-grained experiments that I wanted because each experiment costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time, and we had a lot of things to be playing with. But I think if you're going to choose between BFF and minhash plus suffix array, which I should mention that minhash and suffix array is sort of the industry standard before BFF got so good. I think BFF is preferred because it's much cheaper. The notions of running it goes way faster. The footprint in terms of memory is significantly better. But I think it does need to be run with sharding. I think if you're going to extrapolate and say something even more here, I think multi-resolution methods seem to work best. So like the fact that there were many notions of what it means for a document to be a duplicate, I think you want notions, I think you want a deduplication algorithm that selects for each one of these types of duplicates. And BFF has this nice property where it can do that, whereas like minhash does one and suffix array would do the other. But I think in the end, I think you want things that, come up with the recipe might be, think about all the ways something might be considered a duplicate and make sure you target all of them with your deduplication pipeline. We do see that fewer shards improves performance in our ablations. If you have going from 32 shards to 10 shards seems to help, but it also increases the removal rate, and which means you decrease your final output tokens. And then we also see that if there's 1 shard only, then maybe you are way too aggressive in your deduplication, and you actually can just tank your performance. Okay, so let me get a sense of time. Let's see, I started at, this is around, what am I at, 40 minutes in? So maybe I'll just talk about, let's see, I wanna be judicious with my time here. So maybe I'll just talk about one thing that I have, that I've done in the past couple of weeks, and so it'll be pretty quick, and then leave the rest for many of the research talks I have in my other interviews. I think this is cool. So there's this question of how much unique data is out there, right? So far we've seen that deduplication improves downstream performance, and that sharding is practical, but it has some drawbacks, and it's kind of like a sort of tricky hyperparameter to tune, and that the removal rate, how much you pull out of your data set, scales with the input pool size. If you have more documents to look at and identify duplicates, you're going to find more duplicates. You're going to remove more duplicates. I think there's this question that could be asked is, if we found a new stash of data, and I'm going to say, let's say it's from the same distribution. Let's say it's Common Crawl still before 2013 or something, whatever data set we're using. Let's say Common Crawl just said, oh yeah, we forgot to release this data. And it released a bunch of data. How much novelty would it have? And I think this is a really interesting problem because it's a little bit of math and it takes you around the world. So this problem starts in British Malaya. So in the 1940s, when the Malay Peninsula, so Singapore and what is now Malaysia were British colonies, there was this British ecologist living there, and he was counting butterflies. He lived there for a year. His name was Alexander Corbett, and he would just spend a year counting how many species of butterflies he could find. And he spent a year there, and he said, okay, I got this many species. He went back to England, and he talked to his good friend Fisher of Fisher Information Theory, that Fisher, and said, hey, how many more butterflies would I have found if I had spent another year out there counting butterflies? And they worked on a paper, and they wrote this paper in the 1940s that kind of introduced this unseen species problem, which it's kind of a treat to read a paper, like a math paper from the 1940s, because the typesetting is all different. They have actual log tables. It's really interesting reading entomology papers from back then. So the mathematical problem formally would be if n independent samples are initially taken, and then you take m more samples, how many unique elements, things that you hadn't seen before in the first n, reside in those M extra samples. And the history of this is interesting, right? So it started with butterflies and has like some ecological applications. I think it was used during World War II to count how many tanks the Germans really had. And then, in the 50s, Good and Tolman, so Good of Good Turing, famous computer scientists, found a better statistical estimator for it, and then it got some improvements in the 70s. And then, they found out that you only need frequency counts to do this. If you count how many in your N samples, how many occur once, how many occur twice, how many occur 3 times, and so forth, you can get like some pretty good estimation for this. And I think this kind of culminated, and I think we've kind of solved the problem. We've achieved optimality from this math paper that came out in 2015. And there's a lot of fancy math here, but the sort of final result is you can get like a really good extrapolation for the unseen species problem. So the way you would apply this to deduplication would be to say, if I saw common crawl data and I got like 3 billion documents, and I know that if I ran deduplication, I would, attain, like a 90% removal rate or something. What would happen if I got like 3 billion more documents? How many of those documents would be unique? Which you can say, how big is the internet really before a certain date? And you can plot these, and I ran some plots here. I know this is kind of like hard to see, so I'll zoom in a second, but just know that on the x-axis is the number of documents seen in scale by 1 to the 10th or the 10 to the 10th, and the y-axis is the removal rate, and these are exact duplicates taken from the DCLM pool that we released on Hugging Face, and the actual counts end at the blue line. So let me zoom in here. So for exact duplicates, if you ran exact deduplication on top of our the thing that we released, you get about a 60% removal rate. But if instead of 3 billion documents, you had about 10 billion documents, well, you'd have like a 75% removal rate, which is to say that the 10 billionth document has like only a 1 in 4 chance of being unique. And if you do this with like a fuzzy duplicates, you use min hash, this number rises to like 93%. So I think in that sense, there's maybe we're getting kind of close to exhausting the common crawl pool. Maybe there's actually not that much data out there. I mean, there's enough, but scaling laws still will always require more. Okay, so now I'm gonna skip through my sort of open questions and just go to the conclusion slide. So DCLM, it's a huge project. There's like 57 people on the archive paper. Took a lot of effort. I'm really proud of it. But we ultimately released this open data set, with hundreds of trillions of tokens and 4 trillion high quality tokens, which we think is like a really good data set to maybe further work on and use for your training purposes. And it also is this really nice framework for evaluating data sets. So it's really just I think a good step forward in terms of science towards building better data sets. And of course, because we care about numbers, it's got this fully open source model getting 64 mmLU, which we think is pretty good for things that are open source. And then deduplication, I think that the key takeaways with deduplication is that it's like a really important step, and multi-resolution methods seem to really work the best. You got to identify the ways something could be considered a duplicate and tailor your algorithm to specifically target each one of those things. And I think for that sense, BFF is great. I know this is an AI2 product, so good job, AI2. It's really been nice working with it. And I guess I didn't really go over a lot of my open questions, but there's still a lot we don't know. I think the more I work and think about deduplication, the less I kind of have an understanding of it. And I've just really getting better at asking questions, but there's still a lot of work to do. Okay, so I guess I have around 10 minutes. I'm happy to stay around after, but I'm open for questions.
Hey, this is a really excellent talk. Thanks so much. I had a question, but I think it was a couple of slides ago at the end of, trying to go back to the end of the segment before the future work.
This one?
Yeah. No clear winner, BFF, too many shares. Oh, okay. So I think this is sort of like a higher level speculative question around, I guess in this case, do you see this issue of is there an optimal calibration for BFF? Do you see this something like an optimal calibration for BFF or min hash plus SA as a function of how many tokens you actually want for training? Or do you see this as more like a global, there's like this is a best global way to set your threshold for removal, and any data, any model you want to train for any amount of tokens, you should sort of go off of this best configuration.
Right. I think ultimately, so when we were training things for DCLM, we were kind of governed by engineering restrictions for the size of things. I think ultimately there's probably a sort of golden window of removal rate, and I think maybe you should try and like shard according to sort of stay within that golden window. Now this is like really imprecise and kind of imperfect, but I think we can see that if your window, like if removal rate becomes 90%, you do pretty bad. So I think maybe a removal rate like around like I think maybe 40. The nice thing about that extrapolation work, like this stuff with like the butterflies, is that you can kind of get a sense for, oh well, I know sort of what pool size I would want for this particular removal rate for each sort of distribution of data.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm curious, Matt. Maybe a question to connect the two parts of your talk. Like at the beginning, you mentioned the work on quality classifier and how sort of a lot of like grad student intuitions don't map to what you want to select for language modeling. I'm curious, when you're looking at this deduplication technique and what is a duplicate or not, do you see a similar story of like, oh, your intuition, like what's duplicated or not, is not reflected in what gets selected when you do fuzzy duplication, or it's a more clear story?
I think with notions of duplicates, it is more clear. So I think with data sets, maybe there's things that matter like quantity and quality, but I think there's this third thing called diversity. And oftentimes when we're training language models with like one epoch, so each sort of like context gets seen once, I think the things that you want to make sure are, basically you don't want to see a bunch of junk 10,000 times. With fuzzy min hash on like that pool, I think we had like a connected component bigger than 1 million. So that's kind of arguing that there's repeated tokens, and even if those repeated tokens are really good, it seems like maybe a waste of training budget to be spending all of your, 1 million of your tokens on something that's repeated. And I think maybe that is easier to get a sense for intuition than saying, okay, well, I mean, I think there's also something to be said that, maybe high quality tokens should be repeated, and maybe you can use the duplicate counts to get a sense for like, if you can find some high quality, maybe you can incorporate quality scoring with your deduplication. But in general, I think intuition is kind of works with dedupe because you don't want to repeat things too much, especially if they're sort of lower quality. And it's easier to kind of have an intuitive sense of like what does repetition mean.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions?
Maybe I could jump in. Thanks so much for a really, really great talk. I'm curious about like the design of ablation experiments and specifically for deduplication. How do you have any intuition for like what's the ideal trade-off for the number of parameters to choose for your experiments versus like the duration in terms of data set budget? Because I guess like it seems to me like there would be two, right? Like the larger data set you have, the more duplicates naturally occur, but maybe larger models memorize more or something. So yeah.
Oh, okay, sure. So I am kind of having my hands tied regarding like the sort of trade-off between, so you're asking a question about the trade-off between like parameter size and token count when doing these experiments?
Yeah, if you want to sort of like get the clearest signal on the effect of your deduplication approach.
Right. So ultimately, this is all in service of DCLM, right? This is trying to like build a good data set according to the DCLM rules. And DCLM rules, we like picked scales first, right? That was like the first step. And then, that was done like in some principled sense, right? We used like Chinchilla to kind of get a sense for like how many tokens should we have for each parameter. And we have like these notion of Chinchilla multipliers. So the scaling is kind of like fixed here. I think there are really interesting questions regarding scaling of deduplication. And I guess it was never really clear to us, should we spend, these thousands of CPU hours to do all this min-hash suffix array, or is there something better? So I did kind of just have to choose that we're going to find like a reasonable, like small to medium scale experiment to run this ablations on, because I wanted to run, this is not all the experiments that I wanted to run. This is all the experiments I was allowed to run. There's only so much compute that we have, and there's a lot of sort of medium importance tasks to get really, really well. I would segue here that I think there's a lot of interesting open questions regarding scaling of these duplication ablations, and at the risk of shooting myself in the foot, with some stuff, I think if you subsample a data set, that serves as a form of deduplication. If you have like 100 copies of some, or you have 10 copies of a document, that would get pruned out in a deduplication. But if you take a 1% subsample of it, it's unlikely that you're going to get more than one copy, right? So there's some deduplication that's going on with subsampling. And unfortunately, if you're training according to these scales, that need to be small, you're sort of changing the way that the duplication profile looks. So what we really want in these small scale ablations is something that we can extrapolate and say, oh, this is the right pipeline to do like the sort of like bigger models, right? Something that's maybe seeing like 2.5 trillion tokens. But it's not clear the right way to get the scaling there. So I guess to answer your question, we kind of just picked what was necessary for DCLM, but I think there's maybe some interesting ways to get better signal for scaling and extrapolation of like signal deduplication pipelines.
Thanks so much. Makes sense.
Any other questions?
I have one, but I want to see it. Okay, I can ask it.
I'll
I can
ask you a
ask it.
question.
Okay, I'm
Sure.
gonna poke a little bit at something, Matt. So early on, you talked around this idea around like, I think a very early slide around human intuitions not working out.
Yep. I'll slide back to it. You can keep going.
I am curious because it seems like there's a little bit of tension between these ideas. So we've just sort of experienced a similar thing, which is when we're thinking about quality in data. Sorry, I know it's not duplication directly related.
No.
but
I mean,
yeah.
I want to talk about DCLM too. I mean,
Yeah.
it took a ton of my time, and I'm very invested.
So filtering. We kind of go back and forth between, oh, this is intuitive, right? Like, for example, this is intuitive versus, oh, no, language models behave in their own way and doesn't have to match the human intuition. And it kind of toggles back and forth. An example of this is, even if labeling high quality versus low quality doesn't, and training classifier on those labels doesn't work as well as, taking high quality documents as positive, taking common core random as negative, and training a model. That's still based off some human intuition as we stare at high quality data sets and go like, yeah, this matches, conforms to my intuition of what should be good. I'm trying to understand how you view this tension. Is this a function of, it's like one hypothesis I have is the human intuition actually is good, but the process of curating labels manually doesn't scale enough compared to other proxies for human intuitions, such as just using high quality set. Or a competing hypothesis or complementary hypothesis could be human intuitions only work for very obvious cases, but then once you quickly get out of the obvious cases, then it becomes something else. Something else should be driving it. Like, how do you view this tension?
Oh, both of those hypotheses can be true, and I think there's a grain of truth to each of them. So one is that training classifiers, I mean, anything dealing with language tends to be like pretty data inefficient. So as as many graduate students as we had, maybe we didn't have enough to actually get really good sense of things. And I think just on that sense with classifiers, I think the things that the data that matters the most if you're training a classifier, right? This is a data curation for like image classification, is not the easy examples, it's the hard examples. Right, and I think humans are really good at identifying, okay, this is complete garbage text, or this is, something that seems like really well written, and like if GPT spat this out, I'd be thrilled. So I think humans are really good at identifying the easy stuff, but the sort of the medium stuff, the hard examples, especially if you want to have like a yes/no binary classifier, is really difficult. So I think it's a combination of just that humans are bad at identifying the sort of hard examples for what is helpful and not, like the sort of medium quality. It's like that range is really fuzzy. And maybe it's like less fuzzy with like ELI5. but also the data inefficiency, I think, matters a lot too.
Cool. Thank you. Awesome. I think we're out of time.
Cool. Yeah, we are at time. Let's thank Matt one more time. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending as well.
Thank you. If anyone has any extra questions, I'll make sure that my email is sent out. I know Luca knows how to reach me, but I'm happy to talk about this ad nauseum.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.